If you've been playing VR for a while now, you may have noticed how dry the scene is when it comes to game releases. Most VR games releasing nowadays are made by indie devs, which is fine by me, as in my opinion, within the last few years, indie games have gotten way better while AAA games have all mostly become slop designed purely to rinse you of all your money. But a lot of indie games releasing in the VR scene have mostly become slop Gorilla Tag knockoffs, with the same amount of microtransactions as FIFA 32, where the only difference between the last game is Ronaldo is 0.01% sweatier. I believe the main reason Oh my god. I believe the main reason why AAA companies don't really want to touch VR with a 10-foot pole is because it's just not profitable. Why spend millions of dollars making the next VR game when VR itself is still a fairly niche market? Most people have a PC or a console, but not everyone has a VR headset. And considering AAA game dev studios don't know how to not spend hundreds of millions of dollars on games that will 100% not break even, most game studios out there just see VR game development as a waste of money and resources. And when they do eventually decide to make a VR only game, there's a 50-50 chance it'll be cancelled anyways because the higher ups don't believe it'll make any profit, such as GTA San Andreas VR, which was announced in a Meta livestream and then literally never talked about ever again. This could have been one of the greatest official VR ports of all time, but after the disappointing release of the definitive editions and Rockstar putting all their focus into GTA 6, it's basically 100% confirmed that we are never going to see this game come to the VR scene, at least officially. This was almost certainly announced incredibly prematurely. Not exactly Elder Scrolls 6 levels, but judging by the fact they didn't show a lick of gameplay and basically all they did was show the game's logo and say, yeah, San Andreas coming to Quest 2, bro, trust me. They clearly didn't have an actual game to show here. This could have been game changing for VR, but with the definitive edition's failure, this will never officially release. Another game that I personally was very excited for was Splinter Cell VR. If you watched my 2 VR games I wish existed videos, you'll see that stealth games are something I desperately want more of in VR. And the Splinter Cell franchise has some of the most in-depth stealth in gaming, especially with stuff like the light level feature. This was announced at the same time Ubisoft announced the Assassin's Creed VR game. Unfortunately, only one of them ended up released, as Ubisoft shelved the Splinter Cell VR game to give more budget towards the Assassin's Creed game. Unfortunately as well, this game will most likely never be picked back up, as Ubisoft closed the developers behind Assassin's Creed Nexus after the game sold pretty poorly. It is a huge shame this game got cancelled, but considering how incredibly mediocre Nexus was, I imagine this game would be a pretty poorly received comeback for Splinter Cell, since the last Splinter Cell game was all the way back in 2013. Now this one you may not know about, as its cancellation was only reported fairly recently. Project U, aka Tomb Raider VR, was being developed by Vertigo Games from 2024 until January of this year. I am a fairly big fan of the Tomb Raider reboot trilogy, and a Tomb Raider VR game would genuinely be incredibly sick. Now there were quite a lot of leaked screenshots and footage of this game, but I'm not quite sure if I am actually allowed to show it on here. If you want to see footage though, there's a Road to VR article featuring them in the description of this video. There were some really cool gameplay features shown in the videos and screenshots though, with some classic Tomb Raider weaponry such as the dual pistols from the OG games. This Tomb Raider game seems to be based more on the original games than the reboot trilogy, as most enemies shown off are more supernatural compared to the mostly human enemies we saw in the reboots. This would have been really cool in my opinion, but like literally every other VR game studio, they were closed by Meta back in June, so we'll probably never see this game come to fruition. The next game we're going to talk about here is a Harry Potter VR game. I am not someone who knows much about Harry Potter. I think I maybe watched a movie once, but I know enough to know there was a chance of this being decent. This game was being developed by Skydance Interactive, the same developers who made The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners. We really don't know much about this project other than the developers, that was a Quest 3 exclusive, and the fact it was cancelled around the same time as the Tomb Raider game. Like I said before, I'm not a huge fan of the Harry Potter franchise, so I don't really know the ins and outs of the lore or anything, but if it was being made by the same guys who made Saints and Sinners, I imagine it would have been at least fun to play in some form. Skydance doesn't really make VR games anymore ever since they merged with Paramount, so we will most likely never get a glimpse of what this game could have been. Now the final game here is one I am still mourning to this day, because it was going to be a sequel to one of the greatest VR games ever, Arkham Shadows 2. Arkham Shadows is probably my favourite VR game ever, which is crazy for me to say considering the amount of hours I spent in games like Rec Room and Pavlov. But I am such a massive fan of the Batman Arkham games, and considering how good Shadows was, a sequel would have been actually amazing. The gameplay in the first game feels so good. They perfectly translated the free flow combat system from the flat screen games into VR, and a sequel could have added so many more gadgets and gizmos usable within combat, but Meta has a studio closure and mass layoff addiction, and unfortunately camouflage was on the chopping block. So now there's only a tiny skeleton crew still at camouflage. It's quite clear that Meta only didn't completely close the studio and left behind a few people to make sure there was no articles about camouflage being shut down. It's a massive shame, and I hope another company at some point will completely mog Meta and start releasing games with the studios they bought out without shutting said studios down the second they release the game.